Here are the 5 ways that consumption of wheat and grains leads to high blood sugars. You know, wheat and grains really mess with your blood sugars because of a whole long list of reasons, but here are 5 of the main reasons. First of all, the carbohydrate unique to wheat and grains is called Amylopectin A. Well, Amylopectin A is very unique among carbohydrates in that we have an enzyme in our saliva and also in our stomachs called amylase. And amylase is extremely efficient at breaking down the amylopectin A into glucose. And so if you take a piece of bread, put it in your mouth, chew it, don't swallow it, your blood sugar starts to go up. That's how fast this can be. So the amylopectin A is a unique carbohydrate that is highly digestible. Unlike many of the proteins in wheat and grains that are either partly digestible or completely indigestible, the amylopectin A is the exception, is highly digestible, but explains why 2 slices of whole wheat bread raise blood sugar higher than 6 teaspoons of table sugar. Very few foods raise blood sugar higher than foods made of wheat and related grains. There's something worse though, and that is gluten-free foods. So foods made that are labeled gluten-free, made with cornstarch, tapioca starch, potato starch, or rice flour, are very digestible, even more so than the amylopectin A of wheat, and they raise blood sugar higher than all other foods. Cornstarch's glycemic index, for instance, is 100. You can't go any higher. That's as high as it gets. And that's what you get in many gluten-free foods. But wheat messes with your blood sugar because of its amylopectin A carbohydrate content. Another way that wheat and related grains mess with your blood sugar is that there's a protein in wheat and related proteins in rye, barley, and corn that are not fully digestible. You know, humans don't have the enzymes to digest many of the proteins in wheat and grains because they're seeds of grasses. That's what grains are. And humans are simply not equipped to deal with the proteins in the seeds of grasses. So the GLidin protein of wheat and related grains is only broken down to 4 or 5 amino acid long peptides or fragments. Unlike, say, the proteins in an egg or a piece of bacon or a steak, you break those proteins down into single amino acids. That's how it's supposed to be. But the GLidin protein of wheat and related grains is broken down to 4 or 5 amino acid long peptides. And these peptides have many effects, including inflammatory effects, mind effects, but one of the effects is appetite stimulation. So it increases appetite specifically for carbohydrates, oddly. And so when you eat anything made of wheat or grains, you want more wheat and grains and sugars. So people call it a sweet tooth. I call it a wheat tooth because a sweet tooth is typically caused by the GLidin-derived opioid peptides that drive consumption of wheat and grains and sugars. Another reason why wheat and grains mess with your sugars is that the high insulin level you get from the high blood sugar that results from the amylopectin A, that high insulin, when experienced repetitively, generates insulin resistance. The body becomes unresponsive to insulin, and so muscle, heart, brain, liver become less and less responsive to your body's insulin. The pancreas compensates by increasing its output of insulin hugely. So a slender, active person might have a fasting insulin level of 2 or 3 microunits. A person who's overweight, has a lot of visceral fat, inflammatory fat in the abdomen, and is insulin resistant, has a fasting insulin level of 30, 60, 90 microunits, many fold times higher than the slender insulin responsive person. Well, those high insulin levels cause further accumulation of visceral fat in the abdomen that's very inflammatory. So visceral fat causes insulin resistance, which in turn causes your blood sugar to go higher and higher. That visceral fat is very inflammatory also, and that adds further to high blood sugars. Inflammation is driven by several other factors when you eat wheat and grains. One of the reasons is there's something in wheat called wheat germagglutinin. The GLidin protein is only partially broken down, but wheat germagglutinin is completely impervious to human digestion. It goes in intact in the mouth, it comes out in the toilet intact. But as it passes through the gastrointestinal tract, it's highly inflammatory very toxic to the gastrointestinal cells lining the intestines. But it also enters the bloodstream. A little bit enters the bloodstream, where it's highly inflammatory. So that combination of effects, bowel inflammation and inflammation once it gains access into the blood vessels, very inflammatory, that further drives the insulin resistance that generates high blood sugars. There's another form of inflammation driven by wheat, and that is the GLidin protein of wheat. Because it's poorly digested, sometimes remains intact. And when it's intact, it increases intestinal permeability. It actually separates the barriers between two intestinal cells, and it allows foreign substances access into your bloodstream. One of the things that allows to gain entry into your bloodstream is something called lipopolysaccharide, which is nothing more than the breakdown products of the trillions of bacteria in your gastrointestinal tract. So the trillions of bacteria in your gastrointestinal tract live and die in a very short period of time. They only live for a few hours at a time. And then they shed their byproducts from their cell walls, and that enters the bloodstream because the GLidin protein of wheat increased intestinal permeability. So you can record this. You can actually measure this. There's a test called zonulin, for instance, zonulin serum levels that go up upon consumption of anything made of wheat. And this is in everybody, not people just with celiac or gluten sensitivity. This is everybody. The level of zonulin goes up, reflecting an increase in intestinal permeability. Well, that allows bacterial breakdown products like lipopolysaccharide to gain entry to the bloodstream, a process called endotoxemia or metabolic endotoxemia. And that further adds to insulin resistance and inflammation, further driving up blood sugar. And then lastly, there's something called phytates in wheat, which bind positively charged minerals in your gastrointestinal tract. You poop it out in the toilet. So the phytates of wheat and related grains binds the magnesium very strongly, and you pass it out into the toilet. So if you got magnesium, say, from nuts or other foods, they don't get absorbed. You pass it out into the toilet. Almost all the magnesium gets passed out into the toilet. Well, when you develop long-term magnesium deficiency, one of the effects is a loss of insulin sensitivity and higher or more erratic blood sugars. Now put all those 5 factors together, that is the amylopectin A of grain, GLidin-derived opioid peptides that drive appetite, the accumulation of visceral fat, the development of insulin resistance and inflammation due to wheat germ agglutinin and metabolic endotoxemia, and then lastly the binding of magnesium that you lose in the toilet because of phytates. Put that all together, and you have a food, wheat and grains, that are horrible for blood sugar effects. And it's big part of the reason why we have dietary guidelines that tell us to eat healthy whole grains at every meal, every snack, every day. What do you think happens when you do that? You have a nation of people with insulin resistance. 3/4 of the American population now have insulin resistance. Many of them have progressed to prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and all the other phenomena associated with insulin resistance, such as fatty liver, heart disease, dementia, accelerated skin aging, even cancer. So wheat and grains are foods that are perfectly crafted to make you diabetic and generate insulin resistance and have all those other consequences. What do you do with this? Easy. Don't eat wheat, don't eat grains. Now, you'll go through an opioid withdrawal syndrome that lasts about 5 days. It feels like nausea, headache, fatigue, and depression, but then you come out of it feeling wonderful, and you won't be hungry, and the weight starts to fall off. Inflammatory phenomena recede dramatically. You'll see it in the face. You'll see seborrheic rashes disappear within days. You'll see the contours of your face shrink because the inflammatory edema recedes. In other words, this is not just about blood sugar. That's a big part of it, but it's about so much more. It's about you taking control of your health and weight in dramatic ways that do not involve deprivation. You know, you can have a pizza, you can have cheesecake, you can have muffins, but you're going to make those foods with alternative ingredients. I'll make a muffin, for instance, with almond flour, coconut flour, ground golden flaxseed, and I'll use natural non-caloric sweeteners like stevia, monk fruit, allulose, and some others. If you want to know how this all fits together into a comprehensive program that achieves both weight loss as well as reversal of literally hundreds of health conditions, I invite you to take a look at my newest book, which is the Wheat Belly Revised and Expanded Edition, available just about everywhere. And that collects everything we talk about into one program, a prescriptive program, also gives you the rationale and gives you lots of recipes and new success stories so that you are motivated to succeed at this lifestyle.